Hello and welcome to the 16th in my series of presentations on the conflict between science and creationism. Today I'm going to be talking about the subject of anatomy, the study of the bodily structures of animals and how this sheds light on their evolutionary history. In particular, in this presentation I'll be looking at a number of claims made in the presentations of the infamous young earth creationist Kent Hovind. This means that I won't be covering the whole topic, and I won't even be covering it in any sensible order. I'll just cover the topics that Hovind himself mentions. That's quite a few, by the way. After all, this is a very important subject, and much of the thrust of intelligent design creationism has been in this area. Being a specialist biologist really helps here, as most of these, and their common counterexamples, are fairly easily refuted, but a non-specialist won't be able to provide an answer because the systems involved are really complicated. So given that I'm a non-specialist, I'm relying for some of these on the knowledge and understanding of my peers. But that's okay, that's what science is about. In general, stay away from arguing the details about anatomy unless you really know what you're talking about, because it is a really complex subject. So let's get started. Homologous structures are those many structures that are possessed by all sorts of different animals, which appear to be similar to those in other species. A simple example is the human hand, which appears very similar to the hands of the great apes, for a very good reason, namely that we are very closely related. But the most interesting application of this idea is where an organ, though similar to one in a related species, has been adapted, or technically exapted, to a different purpose. An excellent example is the bone structure of the whale's fin, which makes no sense whatsoever except when one realises that whales are reasonably close evolutionary relatives to all other mammals, having evolved from land-dwelling ancestors since the end of the Cretaceous period. Other excellent examples include the wings of bats and the bone structure in them, which also resembles the hand of other mammalian species. A creationist might simply argue that many structures look similar because they were all created by the same designer, who presumably had a style that he, she or it was following with the skeletons of all animals. After all, why arbitrarily change that design? Surely it would make more sense to design all creatures from the same basic parts, so to speak. Well, for a start, no designer would be constrained by something so trivial and human as aesthetics or measures of effort. There is no reason that I can think of to justify designing any structure in any way that was not absolutely the best way it could have been designed. So when we see structures that are strangely constructed, not in the most optimal way, but in fact in a way that makes no particular sense from a design standpoint, and when we then notice that those structures are very similar to structures in other closely related species, and indeed we have a fossil record showing a sequence of intermediate forms leading precisely between these two versions, then we should certainly look at the design hypothesis very sceptically indeed. Creationists are often keen to point out the fraudulent drawings made by Ernst Haeckel, a German biologist of the 19th century, who claimed that all vertebrate embryos went through very similar stages in the womb. His drawings are often quoted in textbooks and should ideally be accompanied by the historical context explaining that parts of them were exaggerated or even totally false. However, they form an important part of the history of the evolutionary theory, which is why they are often reproduced. Creationists rarely state that the inclusion of these drawings in all good modern textbooks is accompanied by text to this effect. Also, the fact remains that there are still lots of similar features in all vertebrate embryos, and Haeckel's fraud doesn't cancel that out. On this page you can see a reproduction of Haeckel's image, showing a range of animals on the x-axis and the various stages in development down the page. Again, to emphasise this, as I know that Hovind will just claim that I'm using Haeckel's diagram as if it's 100% accurate, Haeckel's image is not based on reliable science. However, it's not 100% inaccurate either. There are some very striking similarities in the appearance of early stage embryos across a wide range of species from mammals to fish and onwards, and Haeckel's dodgy diagram doesn't negate this fact. I'm going to go over these examples in more detail in the next few slides. So here's a slide that you don't want to have to read out when you're feeling tongue-twisted. The theory that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny is called recapitulation and is largely due to the effort of 19th century biologists such as Etienne Serres, Etienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire and of course Ernst Haeckel. This theory states that ontogeny, that is, the stages of embryological development in vertebrate embryos, mirrors the evolutionary ancestry of that species, known as phylogeny. That is to say that the embryo, during its development in the womb, goes through a series of stages, each of which tells the tale of its evolutionary ancestry. This claim is not accepted as universally valid by modern biologists. However, though the theory is not true for all features, it certainly is strikingly true in some cases. There are a great many amazing findings of modern embryology research which show specific examples of embryological stages that are clearly evolutionary relics. For example, human embryos develop a hairy covering over their entire body at around 5 months old. This is called lanugo. This usually falls off about a month before birth, but sometimes persists for a short time after birth. Of course, in monkeys and apes, this hair forms in exactly the same way, but never falls off and instead becomes the creature's hairy coat. Similarly, human embryos develop a small tail at one point, which later recedes to form the coccyx bone. And in the very early stages of development, they show structures which are identical to the structures which, in fish embryos, go on to form gill slits. That's a fairly commonly debated point, so let's look at it in more detail. A prime area of confusion is with the so-called gill slits, another much misunderstood claim of science. All vertebrate embryos go through a stage when they exhibit a feature called pharyngeal pouches. Scientists do not claim that all embryos actually have gill slits in the real sense, they just have features that have been conventionally labelled with that term. In fish, these features actually do become gill slits as the embryo develops. In humans and other mammals, they do not. The common nature of this feature across all vertebrate embryos is good evidence for common descent. The usual creationist straw man argument here is that they claim falsely that scientists think that human embryos actually develop gills, which isn't correct. The fact that human embryos do develop these features is uncontroversial. They're definitely not gills, they are analogous to the features which, in fish, develop into gills. This is a similar misunderstanding to the common creationist confusion about man developing from monkeys, which of course also misses the point that both human beings and monkeys developed from one common ancestor. Vestigial organs are those organs that exist in modern creatures but which serve little or no purpose. They are the remains of organs that existed for a real purpose in our evolutionary ancestors, but which are now no longer necessary and which are, therefore, by the laws of evolutionary parsimony, evolving away. Note that many vestigial organs still have some use in the modern-day animals in which they find themselves, but not usually the same function that they would have served before. For example, whales have leg bones, which may play a minor role in copulation, and humans have an appendix, which does serve a non-vital role in part of the immune system. However, previously, the appendix would have been part of the system that our herbivorous ancestors used to digest cellulose from plant fibres, which we, of course, no longer require. Human beings share close evolutionary ancestors with the other great apes, and slightly more distant common ancestors with the monkeys. Though apes don't have tails, the monkeys do, and most of our prior common ancestors back for several hundred billion years. Indeed, the same thing can be seen in all ape embryos, including humans, in the early stages of their development. The human tail disappears essentially after the 8th week of gestation, and the remains of it are ingested into the developing embryo. Hovind, of course, sets up another straw man here, stating that scientists were claiming that the coccyx, the lowest spine bone, is a useless feature that could harmlessly be removed, in which case he challenges any scientist to have their own coccyx removed. But of course that isn't the claim. The fact is that the coccyx is the fused remnant of what used to be the base of the tail in other vertebrates, so it is no longer functional, in the sense that it no longer acts as the tail, but it is an integral part of the human body, of course. In a similar way, if you have an old house, you may have a fireplace which is no longer used to heat the house, and may no longer function as anything but an architectural decoration, but that doesn't mean that you can necessarily rip it out without the ceiling falling down. An often claimed failing of evolution is the human eye, allegedly so complex that it couldn't possibly have ever evolved. In reality, the evolution of the eye is very easy to understand and doesn't pose any problems whatsoever. The most powerful study is one from Nilsson and Pelge in 1994, which proposed computer simulations to explain the origins of the human eye through a series of simple changes. I quote them in the following. Theoretical considerations of eye design allow us to find routes along which the optical structures of eyes may have evolved. If selection constantly favours an increase in the amount of detectable spatial information, a light-sensitive patch will gradually turn into a focused lens eye through continuous small improvements of design. An upper limit for the number of generations required for the complete transformation can be calculated with a minimum of assumptions. Even with a consistently pessimistic approach, the time required becomes amazingly short, only a few 100,000 years. That was taken from Nilsson and Pelge's 94 paper entitled A Pessimistic Estimate of the Time Required for an Eye to Evolve, from the Proceedings of the Royal Society of London, Biological Sciences, issue 256, pages 53 to 58. In addition to all of this, the eye may well have evolved totally independently in several different lineages. Recent studies cast some doubt on this, but there are definitely very many different designs which may have a common ancestor, but have certainly evolved into complicated visual organs completely separately. Let's have a look at the anatomy of the eye in slightly more detail. I thought I would just throw in a slide showing the anatomy of the eye so that we could discuss it briefly. It does seem reasonably complex at first, but the design, and I use that word deliberately, is actually fairly straightforward. The light enters the eye through an aperture called the pupil at the front. The pupil can be dilated or contracted depending on the prevailing light levels. Behind that is the lens, which focuses the light through a transparent substance called vitreous humour to a photosensitive region on the back wall. The lens can be focused using the ciliary muscles either side of it. The majority of the inner surface of the eye contains photosensitive cells of two types, known as rods and cones. Rods have extremely good sensitivity but cannot resolve colour. Cones can resolve colour but have poorer sensitivity. In addition, there's far fewer of them, roughly 4 or 5 million cone cells compared to the 90 million rod cells. At the back of the eye, the optic nerve carries the detected light signals to the brain. This creates a blind spot at the back of the eye in which no light can be detected. Let's have a look at this problem in more detail. It turns out that the retinal cells in our mammalian eyes are oriented very strangely indeed. Plenty of time has been spent arguing the finer points of eye anatomy, which I don't think is particularly relevant here. Some of the more sophisticated creationist arguments do try to claim that the way the eye functions is indeed optimal, but they all get one or more things wrong about the anatomy of the eye, or, as is the most usual mistake, they forget that the eye has evolved to make the best of a bad design. But if the design had started off differently, then lots of other aspects of how the retinal cells work at a low level would also have been different, and hence much more effective. The blind spot at the back of the retina is a peculiarity of the particular way the cells are arranged, with the nerves transmitting the signal from each rod or cone cell heading backwards into the body of the eye, and then around and towards the optic nerve from the front side, as it were. The photosensitive parts of the retinal cells are at the end furthest away from the light, pointing into the retinal wall. The retinal cells are quite literally plugged in backwards, and there's no good reason to explain this except through evolution. A designer would never have made these cells in this way, but evolution, were it to have started with a simple design of this form, would never have had a chance to change the design completely, so would have made the best of a bad start. Of course, if the rod and cone cells had been plugged in correctly, with the sensitive segment at the front and the nerves passing backwards, then the nerves could all bundle together into an optic nerve behind the retina without the need for a blind spot. And there will be other benefits too. For one, we are sadly susceptible to blinding diseases, which would not happen so much if our eyes had been designed properly. The most common creationist argument against this line of reasoning is that the retinal cells are plugged in backwards in order to aid in heat dissipation. The light-sensitive parts are much closer to the layer where heat can be removed from the cells and into the bloodstream. If they'd been plugged in correctly, then this would not be the case and the cells would overheat. But this misses the obvious point, that if the cells were plugged in correctly, then they wouldn't have an overheating problem in the first place. Plenty of animals have eyes with this more sensible configuration, such as squid. Their retinal cells are plugged in the correct way round, and their eyes don't overheat and burn out. In fact, squid are able to see extremely well, even in the incredibly poor lighting conditions of the deep oceans. This is an old classic, the claim that even Darwin thought that the eye hadn't evolved. Of course, the claim is a false one, and is a perfect example of creationists deliberately being dishonest and trying to mislead. Darwin's quote, and it is a genuine quote, begins like this: "To suppose that the eye could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest possible degree." This quote is taken from On the Origin of Species, chapter 6. However, if you don't stop reading at the end of that sentence and instead continue reading to the next sentence, the paragraph continues like this: "Yet, reason tells me that if numerous gradations from a perfect and complex eye to one very imperfect and simple, each grade being useful to its possessor, can be shown to exist, if further the eye does vary ever so slightly and the variations be inherited, which is certainly the case, and if any variation or modification in the organ be ever useful to an animal under changing conditions of life, then the difficulty of believing that a perfect and complex eye could be formed by natural selection, though insuperable by our imagination, can hardly be considered real." So, not only did Darwin not see any problems whatsoever with the evolution of the eye, even back in the mid-19th century, but creationists actually quote the exact moment where he conclusively states this fact. though they dishonestly only ever quote the first half of the quote, thus completely changing its effect. The claim of all levels of creationism proponents, from young earthers right the way through to intelligent design, is that there are structures in nature that are too complex to have evolved. If even one component of these structures was removed, then the entire structure would fail to work. How then could such a structure evolve? The intelligent design proponent claims God did it, an intelligent designer did it, but the scientist cannot capitulate to such intellectual cowardice. As it happens, in all such examples that have been brought to light in this argument, there is in fact no problem whatsoever with those structures having evolved from simpler components. Just because a seemingly irreducibly complex system could not exist without all of its parts, it could certainly have existed previously, perhaps to fulfill a different role, or to a lesser degree. It could also have evolved through a number of prior stages in which it had a different purpose, which could have been selected for. The most commonly suggested examples of irreducibly complex organs are the bacterial flagella, the vertebrate immune system, and the feathers of birds. All of these have very convincing models to explain exactly how they could have evolved through a continuum of simple changes. Michael Behe, author of Darwin's Black Box, is undeniably the leading proponent of this irreducible complexity theory worldwide. However, when he was put on the stand in the Dover, Pennsylvania trial, he came up with his three greatest examples, the three given above, and all three were very comprehensively torn apart by the experts. You don't need to know the details of these arguments. They are very complex, but they can be found online with a simple search. Be careful here of the distinctly tricksy language used by creationists. There are, of course, many structures in modern organisms that are, in a sense, irreducibly complex, and by that I mean that they consist of several parts that, individually, are all vital to the correct functioning of the structure. However, what Behe and other intelligent design proponents claim is that such structures could not possibly have evolved, which is false. As I said, there are very good models for all of these. The Dover, Pennsylvania trial in 2005, which I referenced in the previous slide, was a landmark trial for intelligent design, the most recent distinct flavour of creationism to attempt to attack the public school system, mainly in the US. This trial resulted in a complete rout of the creationists who, forced to support their arguments in front of a panel of actual experts, completely and utterly failed to provide any rational justification whatsoever for their views. But perhaps more importantly, this trial brought to light the, in the word of the judge, breathtaking inanity of those involved, and the extraordinary level of immorality to which they stooped, both in lying under oath about details of their case and in deliberately attempting to mislead those opposed to their cause at every stage of the way. I think I would like to finish off this section by reading three separate quotes from Judge Jones's ruling in this case, and there are many, many more, I assure you. If you care to read through the trial report online, you can find it with a fairly easy Google search. These three quotes show, I believe, the profound failure of the irreducible complexity theory and, with it, the entire edifice of intelligent design. Firstly, as expert testimony revealed, the qualification on what is meant by irreducible complexity renders it meaningless as a criticism of evolution. In fact, the theory of evolution proffers exaption as a well-recognised, well-documented explanation for how systems with multiple parts could have evolved through natural means. The second quote. We therefore find that Professor Behe's claim for irreducible complexity has been refuted in peer-reviewed research papers and has been rejected by the scientific community at large. And the third quote. On cross-examination, Professor Behe was questioned concerning his 1996 claim that science would never find an evolutionary explanation for the immune system. He was presented with 58 peer-reviewed publications, 9 books, and several immunology textbook chapters about the evolution of the immune system. However, he simply insisted that this was still not sufficient evidence of evolution, and that it was not good enough. To anyone who believes passionately in a delusion based on emotion and fear, not on logic and evidence, there is never going to be enough proof for them to accept that they're wrong. Sometimes you just have to nod, smile, and step slowly away. Those were my words, by the way, not Judge Jones's, although I'm pretty sure he was thinking the same thing by the end of the trial. Well, that's all for now. As ever, there's loads more information on my website at frame.net, where you can also find a transcript of this talk, and all the following ones, and all the previous ones. And you can keep up to date with my blog, as well as learning about some of my other work. See you next time when I'll be talking about the process of speciation, that is, how totally new species can evolve and diverge from common ancestors. Thanks for listening.